The COVID pandemic has turned the life of our churches upside down. We all know that. And as we struggle out of various forms of lockdown, lots of folk are asking, what should we do now? I've spoken to numerous clergy and church leaders about this, and many are feeling the pressure to get things going again. And from what I hear, it's all about making strategies and action plans. It's all about doing things, about doing a lot more things. And almost without exception, the clergy and church leaders I've spoken to recently are despondent about all of this, and some are depressed and anxious. They feel they should get on and do these things, but they are frank with me, their heart is not in it. And sometimes there's pressure from prominent church members to make things happen, and sadly also too at times from the church hierarchy. So I've been thinking about what's going on. Are these church leaders and clergy just lazy? Have they lost their sense of calling? Or do they just need a big boot up the backside? Well, what is also interesting is that there seems to be an increasing number of church members who are feeling the same way too. They've just not got the energy to get back to doing things as they were before. And some are honest and say they've actually quite enjoyed the peace, quiet and space of lockdown and the lack of church activities and organisations. Well, I'm going to share with you some thoughts because I think the time we're going through is really important and even interesting for the church and maybe too for society and the world at large. Well, I'm with the church leaders in their despondency and their dismay. I'm with them all the way. I'm with them in not getting the life of the church back to normal, as if there was a normal. I believe that through the despondency that we suffer, there is a crack in the life of the church through which a light might shine to show us to a different future. Not based on quickly cobbled together strategies or easy answers or unrealistic expectations. I think the really important question to ask here is this: what biblical story are we following? What story from the Bible are we following at the moment? Well, when I look back over the years of my Christian life, I think we have majored on just a few stories to the exclusion of many others. We have traded in some Bible stories more than others, highlighting ones such as God's people entering Canaan to conquer the land, the rebuilding of Jerusalem with Ezra and Nehemiah, the growth of the church in Acts chapter 2, and Paul's missionary stories. They're all great, but they're all talking about taking ground, moving forward, and positive development. We have to ask ourselves, but is that where we are today? On the back of these stories, we have been involved in a multitude of activities and missions, especially across the evangelical churches. If you go back that far, in the 1950s and 60s, there were the Billy Graham campaigns. Then we had local parish and church missions, often run by students from the various colleges up and down the country. We had Mission England, again with Billy Graham. And then following him, Louis Palau came, the Argentinian evangelist, and there was a campaign across the country with him. In the 1990s, we had the Decade of Evangelism, followed by the enthusiastic church planting movement. I could go on. There are all the other various charismatic and revivalists movements that include John Wimber, the Kansas City Prophets, the Toronto Blessings, and other emphases too, which came or inspired from across the pond. It's interesting to note that all of these activities somehow can easily play into massaging our own egos. We say we do them for the glory of God, but like old Achan of the Old Testament story, we like to keep a bit back for ourselves, to please ourselves. Well, there are some stories of success, as you might call it, from all this activity. But I would contend that none of these movements have made a lasting impact on what most congregations, where most congregations are today, who worry about paying their way and their own survival. We have to ask ourselves, how could all this enthusiasm and activity amount to so very little? How is it that all of our hopes and prayers that we invested into this mission seem to have come to nothing in the main? And how is it that our churches are dwindling? That we bemoan the fact that our children haven't taken our place within the life of the church? And two, that increasingly we feel sidelined by society as a whole. Well, I'm not aware that there has been a lot of open discussion about why all of this has not worked. There has been some. Yet, strangely, there is an urge in the churches to get on and do yet more of the same. More of what has not worked for 50 years. Well, any aware alcoholic will tell you this. To carry on doing the same thing, expecting a different outcome, is a sign of madness. Well, I think there's a lot of madness about. So, where do we go from here? I don't know whether this is exactly right or not, but many folk I shared this with say, yes, there's a lot of truth in that. So let's go back to that question I posed a little earlier. What biblical story or stories are we following? Because I think we probably have not been following the most appropriate stories for our time. There are other stories which probably fit better our situation of apparent decline, emotional despondency, and mere exhaustion. These are the stories of exile, the desert or the wilderness, Easter Saturday, or the two men walking on the road to Emmaus before the truth dawned, or the laments of the Psalms of the Old Testament. Well, in case you're not too familiar with the story of exile, let me just recap simply what happened. When the people of God entered the promised land, they were told, don't have a king, it's not good for you. And anyway, God said, I'm the king, you don't need a king. But after time, the people looked over their shoulders and saw that the other nations had kings and thought they'd rather like to have a king themselves too. They wanted the apparent power and potency that they thought others had had. Well, Samuel was the prophet, and he warned them, it won't be good for you if you have a king, because the king will tax you heavily, take your lands, and enslave you. He will put your sons in the army, where they'll get killed, and your daughters he'll take into his palaces, and it wasn't just for doing domestic duties. And he warned them about much more besides. The people said, however, we want a king. And so God, being gracious, granted them their request. Well, we might have spent all the years telling all the good stories from the kings, David, Solomon, and the rest. But the record showed, on the whole, the kings were not good for Israel or for the people. In fact, some passages say they were a disaster. They corrupted and bankrupted the nation. Well then, the year 587 BC is etched in the minds and the psyche of the Jewish people, and should be in ours too. It was the year when the armies of the Empire of Babylon invaded and defeated Israel, putting an end to the line of kings, the kings which God never wanted in the first place. Now, devastation is too light a word to describe what happened. Everything was lost. All governance. The temple was flattened. The monarchy was finished. The economy was devastated. And there was no rule of law. It would be as if Britain had been invaded and had lost the Houses of Parliament, all of the cathedrals, Buckingham Palace, Downing Street, the London Stock Exchange with the banks, the law courts and the police force. It was just unthinkable. No one, but a few prophets, saw this coming or thought that God would allow anything like this to happen to them. Their mantra was, God won't abandon us, in their arrogance. Well, all the movers and shakers, the influential leaders, those who held power and sway, were dragged off the great city of Babylon into exile. God's people could not have faced a bigger shock. It looked like the end of everything for them. So the crucial question for God's people in exile was then, how could God let this happen to us? God's chosen people. And maybe today we need to ask a similar question. How can God let this happen to the church today? Well, we may get a window into what was happening in Babylon when we read Psalm 137, a psalm made popular by Boney M with their song by the rivers of Babylon. This psalm tells us the Jewish people sat on the banks of the river and they mourned what had happened to them and to Jerusalem. They didn't have it in them to sing, so they hung up their harps on the trees. And all the while, the locals would come along and taunt them and go, "Go on, sing us one of your little Jewish ditties from Jerusalem. Give us a little song, will you?" But how could they sing in a foreign land? How could they sing when all had been lost? In exile, Babylon, God's people faced three primary temptations. The first was despair. For many, depression set in. Nothing could be done. Nothing could be done about their defeat and their loss. There was no hope. And maybe they ended up blaming each other, as happens when things go wrong. They were utterly defeated. They had lost their sense of certainty. Nothing was guaranteed any longer, as they had assumed. And maybe too, we have lost our certainty and sense of privilege. Nothing is guaranteed for us any longer either, because maybe we too had made assumptions. The first primary temptation was despair. The second temptation was assimilation. So the folk were taken into Babylon, to the great city, and after a while some sort of looked around and thought, well, it's Babylon, it's quite a nice place really. It's certainly a good match for Jerusalem. Hanging gardens, developed culture, its grandeur, its magnificence. nice and comfortable. And some decided, we'll just become Babylonians. And that was it. But we wrongly, I think, blame our younger people for assimilating. I don't think they're comfortable with that. And I think our judgment is on the whole wrong. The second primary temptation was assimilation. And the third was denial. Other folks said, there's no real problem. We'll soon be back in Jerusalem. That's how things happen. And by our strategies and skill, we'll sort it all out. God would never abandon us. They simply wouldn't acknowledge the depth of the crisis. They wanted to pretend it wasn't all that bad. And after all, they had some good ideas. Well, if the church is not in despair today, it is often in denial. We can sort this out. We need a planning group. We need to rearrange things. We need to get back to normal. We need another strategy paper, another good idea, another group to meet together to work out a way forward. I think it's denial, folks. It's denial. Why can't we just own up to where we are and have that sense in which actually the future is up to God and not our good ideas? A lot of the preaching I hear, I think, reflects this denial. Most of it seems to be about comfort and reassurance, which are good things, but they're not the only things. Comfort and reassurance, which says, God loves you. God's with you. God's on your side. Well, that's not what the people felt in exile. It either says that, or it says, we need to get out there and get involved, or tell them, or preach the gospel, or tell. I think it's denial. And when I sit and hear that, my soul is not fed, and I sense too that that is true for so many other people as well. The people who were the real hope for God's people were those who sat on the bank and cried. Those who wept, those who shed tears in grief, and the pain came tumbling out. And later Jesus would say, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. I hope you know that when somebody loses a loved one, it happens to all of us, the best thing they or we can do is to mourn and grieve. Not keep busy, which is about denial after all. And once they have worked through the long and complex process of grief, then and only then may they start to get a glimpse of a different future. This is true too for us as the people of God. It was the weepers in exile and the criers who were the key to the future of God's people, not the activists. In fact, they are part of the problem, I contend. Not the people with multiple ideas, not those who just thought we need to get back to Jerusalem, we need to get back to normal, or whatever we say. And I hope you know, COVID is not the cause of all of this. Something has been going on for at least decades. All COVID has done is to bring the crisis forward by a few years. And maybe at least we should be thankful for that. So it was through exile, through the weepers and the mourners, that God started his new work. He started to raise up like street poets who spoke about new possibilities. We call them the prophets, but that's what they were. They were street poets. They didn't give advice to people. They didn't hand over a plan, but they spoke in open, porous language that helped the people consider new and different possibilities, to see what they would not have otherwise seen. And they added that the new cannot be received until the old and the past has been let go of. It was these street poets who spoke about a rather different figure, one called the Son of Man, as in Daniel, one called a suffering servant, as in Isaiah. They spoke about a time when weapons would be melted down and formed into farming equipment, when the poor would be lifted up, and when God would be king, and when God would reign, not these tin pot people they had before. So the people of Jerusalem remained in exile physically for 50 years or so. But it was over 500 years before Jesus came. Exile, spiritually and theologically in the Bible, lasted not 50 years, but 500. That's shocking, isn't it? God's people had to wait for God. So we're not talking necessarily about a quick, easy fix with God. We're not hoping for a revival to pull us out of the nosedive. We want God to do something deeper, more real. And God will at some point, and that will be our future. But it may take longer than we want it to take, and it may take longer than my or your lifetime. I would just add here, of course, that many would consider that it is not just the church which is entering exile, but the Western world as a whole, with its decadent culture and exploitative economy, or maybe the global world with climate change and the pollution crises. The desert is also relevant to where we are today. The desert is the place where you are aware you are no longer in control and you're surrounded by threat and danger. But biblically, it is in the wilderness where the newness can be received and old attachments lost. The wilderness. Also too, let me talk about the road to Emmaus very briefly. These two disciples walking out to Emmaus, their heads down, on the evening of the resurrection, not knowing that Jesus had risen. And what was their sad story? Their sad story was, we had hoped. We had hoped that, and this is a sort of grieving. It's same for us. We had hoped. All of that we've done, all that effort we put in, all of that prayer, all that activity, all that commitment, all that Bible study, we had hoped. We had hoped we would be more successful and it would renew our churches. We had hoped our children would take up our roles in the church. We had hope that growth in number across all the churches would happen on our watch. This, folks, is our grief, and we need to mourn about it. I can remember 40 years ago, many people saying, well, I just sense God's going to do something new. Something exciting is around the corner. Well, we didn't think God had this in mind, did we? We had hope for something bigger and nicer. Something to stroke our ego, no doubt. That's the road to Emmaus. And then the Psalms. I've often been told, and told others, that 1/3 of the Psalms are about lament. We even have a book in the Old Testament called the Book of Lamentations, songs of sadness. I've never heard it read in church, by the way. And sadly, we don't know how to lament. We know how to complain and moan, but not lament. And two, I think we also or maybe in a sort of a Easter Saturday moment. Something has been lost and the new has not come. Sometimes we call it liminal space. Something has died or is dying and the newness has not come, and it might not be 24 hours round the corner. So where do we go from here? I've got 4 things here to say. We need to start talking honestly about our situation and stop kidding ourselves that we can fix it. I don't think we can. Denying what is happening is just making us deaf to the voice of the Spirit. We need to give up our addiction of problem solving. Surely we're past all of that now. Surely. Secondly, God won't keep the show on the road just for our comfort or to please us or to stroke our egos, so that we can say, oh, while we were here, the church grew. Jesus said he would build the church. So I have no doubt about its future, but it might not look, though, like what we want it to look like. And we might not be happy with that. Thirdly, we need to learn the lost art of grieving. So much has been lost and is being lost. The church has been in decline for 50 years. Many would say much longer than that. We had hoped, but it hasn't happened. And many in our churches are lost and they are hurt if they have not drifted away. And without doing our grief work, our pain comes out in blame and anger, of which there is much in the church at the moment. We can no longer go on pretending that this doesn't hurt. And fourthly, let us be open to the voices from the margins. This is the place where the poets and the artists come from. It is the home of the prophets. Let's not keep placing all our hope in strategies, plans, and church activities. They have their place, but I'm not sure they have much of a place here at the moment to where we are. Can we instead adopt an attitude of hopeful imagination and be open to what we had never considered previously? Open to what might scare us and also to what might threaten our vested interests. If we can learn to grieve, then maybe we can help a world that is also in denial about its plight and its addiction to economic destructive growth as it rapes the earth of its goodness. A world that thinks it can manage its way out of its present crisis with more fixes, more policies and more technology. It's all the same mindset in the world and in the church. What the world needs and what the church needs is a presently unknown newness, not new ideas. My plea to you is to consider some of these other biblical stories where eventually the people receive something that they could never have imagined humanly. Just to close, let me just mention Proverbs chapter 29 verse 18, which is often trotted out in times such as this. Where there is no vision, the people perish. So, what's the vision, people say? Let's form a vision. Let's get our flip chart out and post-it notes. Let's sort out where we're going. Have a vision statement, a strap line, and then a strategy. Well, that is the King James Version translation of that verse. A more accurate translation, interestingly, is where there is no prophecy, the people perish. Proverbs 29 verse 18. Where there is no prophecy, the people perish. And maybe that's what we're lacking at the moment and why we're perishing. So it is these wily figures who live on the edge of our traditions who may well hold the key. It's time to start looking elsewhere for answers, not to the top, folks. And you never know, we may even hear the voice of God. I hope we do. I believe we will in time.